The sun was blazing high above the downtown Los Angeles skyline, reflecting off the glass windows of the tall buildings and turning the city into a giant oven. It was one of those afternoons where the heat seemed to rise right off the concrete, wrapping around everyone like a heavy, invisible blanket. Down on the closed-off street, the movie set was buzzing with energy. It was a chaotic kind of organized noise. You could hear the shout of instructions, the hum of generators, and the heavy thud of equipment being moved around. In the middle of all this noise was Keanu Reeves. He was standing near a camera crane, dressed in a simple but heavy costume for the scene. He didn't look like a big movie star. The sun was blazing high above the downtown Los Angeles skyline, reflecting off the glass windows of the tall buildings and turning the city into a giant oven. It was one of those afternoons where the heat seemed to rise right off the concrete, wrapping around everyone like a heavy, invisible blanket. Down on the closed-off street, the movie set was buzzing with energy. It was a chaotic kind of organized noise. You could hear the shout of instructions, the hum of generators, and the heavy thud of equipment being moved around. In the middle of all this noise was Keanu Reeves. He was standing near a camera crane, dressed in a simple but heavy costume for the scene. He didn't look like a big movie star in that moment. He looked like just another hard-working person trying to get the job done. He was sipping water from a plastic bottle, his eyes scanning the set, watching the crew work. Everyone knows the stories about him, how he is kind, how he treats the interns and the background actors with the same respect as the producers. But seeing it in person was different. It wasn't an act. He was genuinely present. During a break in the filming, while the lighting crew was adjusting some big reflectors, Keanu noticed a young woman standing off to the side. She was a background extra, dressed in a business suit that looked far too warm for the weather. She was shifting her weight from one foot to the other, looking a little nervous and out of place. Keanu didn't hesitate. He walked over to her, wiping a bit of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He started talking to her, asking if she was okay in the heat. He cracked a small joke about how the air conditioning in the buildings they were pretending to work in was definitely broken. The young woman laughed, her shoulders dropping as she relaxed. It was a small moment, the kind of thing that usually goes unnoticed in the grand scheme of a movie production, but it showed exactly who he was. He wasn't rushing back to his private trailer to hide. He was standing there in the sun, making sure a stranger felt comfortable. Soon, the first assistant director's voice crackled over the loudspeaker, calling everyone back to their positions. The mood shifted from relaxed to focused instantly. The scene they were about to shoot was a big one. It involved a lot of movement, running, and a physical stunt that Keanu had insisted on doing himself. He didn't like using stunt doubles for the things he felt he could handle. He believed it made the movie look better, made it feel more real for the audience. "Action!" the director yelled. Keanu took off running. His boots hit the pavement hard. He sprinted toward a marked spot, his face contorting into the intense expression of the character he was playing. He jumped, cleared a low obstacle, and landed with a roll. It was perfect. The crew held their breath, watching the monitors. He popped back up, delivered his lines with a rough, gritty voice, and stood still as the director called, "Cut." "Perfect," the director said over the speaker. "Let's reset for the next angle." A ripple of applause went through the crew. It was genuine appreciation for a hard day's work. Keanu smiled, nodding his head, and walked back to his starting mark. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving up and down. Anyone could see that he was tired, but he waved off a production assistant who came forward with a chair and a fan. He shook his head, signaling that he was fine to keep going. They set up the next shot. This one was even more demanding. The heat was getting worse as the afternoon went on, making the air shimmer above the street. Keanu took his position, his eyes locked on the distance. But this time, when he started to move, something felt different. He wasn't running quite as fast. His movements seemed just a fraction heavier, like he was carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders. He finished the run and grabbed the edge of a prop table to steady himself. He closed his eyes for a brief second, taking a deep breath. The makeup artist hurried over to dab the sweat from his face and reapply some powder. Keanu looked at her and gave a weak smile, but there was no sparkle in his eyes this time. He looked pale, which was strange considering how hot it was. "You good, man?" the prop master asked, handing him a different prop for the next scene. "Yeah, just a little lightheaded. It's the heat. I'll be fine." He stood up straight, trying to shake it off. He walked over to the center of the set for the final shot of the day. Everyone was tired. Everyone wanted to go home. The energy on the set was tense, but hopeful that they could get this one last take in the can. The director called, "Action!" again. Keanu began the dialogue. He was delivering his lines with power, but as he stepped forward, he stumbled. It wasn't a trip over a cable or a misstep on the uneven pavement. It was like his legs simply stopped listening to his brain. He caught himself, though, and kept going. He was a professional. He pushed through the dizzy spell and finished the line. Then, silence. He didn't move toward the next mark. He just stood there, swaying slightly like a tree in a breeze. The camera kept rolling for a moment, the operator unsure if this was part of the performance. But then, Keanu's knees buckled. It wasn't a dramatic collapse like in the movies. It was slow and heavy. He crumpled to the ground, his body hitting the asphalt with a sickening thud. "Cut!" the director screamed, but this time it wasn't a command. It was a shout of panic. "Cut! Cut! Is he okay?"
For a second, nobody moved. It was as if the entire world had stopped spinning. Then, the set exploded into action. People dropped their equipment and ran toward him. The medic on set, a young guy who was usually joking around with the crew, sprinted across the street, his medical bag bouncing against his hip. Keanu was lying on his back, his eyes open but staring at nothing. He wasn't responding to the voices calling his name. His breathing was shallow and way too fast. The medic knelt beside him, checking his pulse and shining a light in his eyes. The look on the medic's face sent a cold chill through everyone who saw it. It wasn't a look of calm confidence. It was a look of serious worry. "Back up! Give him some air!" the medic yelled, waving his hand at the crowd of actors and crew members who had gathered in a tight circle. Someone called 911 on their cell phone, their voice shaking as they gave the location. The director stood a few feet away, clutching his headset, his face drained of all color. He looked helpless. This was his set, his movie, but in that moment, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the man lying on the hot ground. Keanu's personal assistant pushed through the crowd, looking terrified. He knelt down next to the medic, asking questions that nobody had answers to yet. "What happened? Is he breathing? Keen, can you hear me?" There was no answer. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours. The medic stayed by Keanu's side, monitoring his vitals, keeping his airway open. He placed a rolled-up jacket under Keanu's head to keep him off the burning pavement. The sun was still beating down mercilessly, indifferent to the emergency. A crew member held a large reflector over Keanu's body to create some shade, his arms trembling with the effort of holding it steady for so long. Far off in the distance, the faint wail of a siren began to echo through the downtown streets. It was a sound that everyone recognizes, a sound that usually makes you feel annoyance or impatience when you were driving. But here, on the quiet movie set, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. It meant help was coming. The siren grew louder and louder, cutting through the heavy air. People on the sidewalk outside the set perimeter stopped to watch, pointing and whispering. They didn't know what was happening, but they could see the panic and the flurry of activity behind the metal barriers. Finally, an ambulance turned the corner, its lights flashing. It drove right onto the sidewalk, stopping just feet away from the crowd. Two paramedics jumped out with a gurney and their equipment boxes. They moved with practiced speed, pushing through the stunned crew members. "We have a male, mid-50s, collapsed after physical exertion. Unresponsive for about 3 minutes. Pulse is rapid and weak. Breathing is labored." The paramedics took over immediately. They attached sticky pads to Keanu's chest to check his heart rhythm. They started an IV line, his skin looking pale and almost gray against the black asphalt. One of the paramedics shined a light in his eyes again and talked to him loudly, trying to get a response. "Keanu, can you squeeze my hand? Keanu!" Nothing. They worked quickly and efficiently, lifting him onto the stretcher. As they strapped him in, his arm flopped lifelessly to the side. Seeing someone so full of life just minutes ago look so fragile was a shock that nobody on that set would ever forget. The director walked over as they were lifting the gurney. He looked like he wanted to say something, to apologize or to wake Keanu up and tell him it was just a bad joke, but he couldn't speak. He just reached out and touched Keanu's shoulder gently. "We're taking him to County General," one of the paramedics said to the assistant. "You can follow behind us." The ambulance doors were shut with a loud clunk. The vehicle accelerated away, the siren wailing into the distance, leaving the set behind in a strange, heavy silence. The crew stood there, staring at the empty space where the actor had fallen. The props, the cameras, and the lights suddenly looked silly and unimportant. The makeup girl was crying quietly, being comforted by a coworker. The young extra Keanu had been talking to earlier was standing alone, her hand over her mouth, unable to process what she had just seen. Nobody went back to work. The director looked at his watch, then at the sun dipping lower in the sky. He knew they were behind schedule. He knew the movie was costing thousands of dollars every minute they didn't film. But looking at the exhausted, worried faces of his crew, he knew there was no way they could continue. "Pack it up," the director said softly, his voice carrying through the quiet street. "We're done for the day. Go home, everyone. Just go home." Slowly, people began to move. They started dismantling the equipment, but there was no energy in it. They were working like robots, their minds far away, thinking about the kind man who had joked about the heat and then collapsed without warning. As the city lights began to flicker on in the tall buildings around them, the mood was somber. It wasn't just a colleague who had been hurt, it felt like a friend. And as they loaded the trucks, a silent prayer went up from the entire crew, hoping that the sirens had reached the hospital in time, and that the story wouldn't have a tragic ending. The ambulance didn't slow down until it reached the entrance of the emergency wing. The tires screeched against the pavement as the vehicle came to a sudden halt. The back doors swung open instantly, and the
Paramedics jumped out, grabbing the rails of the stretcher. The automatic glass doors at the hospital entrance slid open with a quiet swoosh, welcoming the chaos from the street into the cool, sterile air of the medical center. The transition from the bright, noisy movie set to the white, fluorescent-lit hallway was jarring. Inside the ER, the atmosphere was thick with tension. It wasn't the controlled tension of a film set, it was the raw, nervous energy of life and death. Doctors and nurses in blue scrubs moved with urgency, shouting instructions and answers over the heads of patients waiting in chairs. Dr. Vance, the attending physician on duty, was standing at the nurses' station when the paramedics burst through. She was a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair and a face that had seen thousands of emergencies. She was known for her calm demeanor, but today her eyes widened as she recognized the face on the stretcher. It was Keanu Reeves. However, her professionalism took over immediately. In a hospital, a famous face is just a patient who needs help. "He's unresponsive," the lead paramedic shouted as they wheeled the gurney into Trauma Room 1. "We found him down on a movie set. History of exertion. Heart rate is 160 and thready. Blood pressure's dropping, 90/60 and falling." Dr. Vance snapped into action. "Let's get him on the monitor. I need 2 large-bore IVs, stat. Draw labs, troponin, CBC, metabolic panel, and coagulation studies. Let's get a portable chest X-ray and an EKG running now." The trauma room was a small, cramped space filled with beeping machines and bright lights. The nurses tore open packages of sterile equipment, while the resident doctor placed a mask over Keanu's face to pump oxygen into his lungs. His chest rose and fell, but the movement was shallow and weak. He looked incredibly pale, a stark contrast to the tanned, action hero image the world was used to seeing. Dr. Vance stood by the bedside, watching the heart monitor intently. The green line jumped across the screen in a jagged, erratic pattern. It was a dangerous rhythm, a sign that his heart was under immense stress. She placed her stethoscope against his chest, listening to the hurried, galloping sounds. "He's in atrial fibrillation with rapid ventricular response," she said, her voice steady but loud enough for the team to hear. "We need to control this rate before he goes into cardiac arrest. Start metoprolol, 5 milligrams IV push." The nurse nodded and carefully administered the medication into the IV line.
Everyone in the room held their breath for a moment, watching the monitor to see if his heart would respond. Outside the glass partition, the hallway was filling up. The producers and assistants from the movie set had arrived and were huddled near the nurses' station. They looked terrified, their faces pale under the harsh hospital lights. Hospital security was trying to keep them back, creating a buffer zone between the Hollywood drama and the medical reality. Inside the room, the EKG machine spat out a long strip of paper. Dr. Vance snatched it up, her eyes scanning the squiggly lines for clues. She frowned. It didn't look like a classic heart attack. Usually, with a blockage, you see specific changes in the waves, elevations that scream blocked artery. This was different. The electrical activity was chaotic, messy. It was as if the heart's wiring was short-circuiting, but the muscle itself might be okay. "Blood pressure's coming up slightly," a nurse called out. 110/70. "Good," Dr. Vance replied, though her brow was still furrowed. "Keep monitoring. Let's get him up to CT scan. We need to rule out a pulmonary embolism or aortic dissection. With that kind of collapse and pain, we can't guess." They disconnected the bedside monitor and hooked up a portable one. The team wheeled the bed out of the room and down the long corridor toward the radiology department. The squeak of the gurney wheels echoed off the walls. Dr. Vance walked beside the bed, her hand resting on the rail. She looked down at Keanu's face. He was so still. It was strange to see a man known for his energy and movement lying so motionless. She whispered a silent command to his body to fight, to hold on. In the CT suite, the machines hummed with power. They slid him into the large, white donut-shaped scanner. Dr. Vance and the radiologist stood behind a thick glass wall, watching the images appear on the computer screens slice by slice. They scanned his brain first, looking for signs of a stroke or bleeding. "Brain looks clear," the radiologist said, relieved. "No hemorrhage, no mass." Dr. Vance let out a breath she had been holding. "Okay, check the chest. Look at the lungs and the heart." They moved to the chest images. The radiologist zoomed in, enhancing the contrast to look at the blood vessels. They studied the aorta, the main artery carrying blood away from the heart. They looked for a tear, which would be a deadly emergency. "Aorta is intact," the radiologist said, moving the mouse around. "Lungs are clear, no clots, no fluid." Dr. Vance crossed her arms. So no stroke, no dissection, no pulmonary embolism. His CT is essentially normal. She felt a wave of frustration. She wanted to find something obvious, a broken bone or a burst vessel, something she could fix. A mystery in the ER is a dangerous thing. If she didn't know what was wrong, she couldn't treat it effectively. "Let's get him back to the trauma bay. We need to figure out why his heart is throwing these rhythms if his anatomy looks fine."
They moved him back to the room. The medication they had given him earlier seemed to be working a little. His heart rate was down to 120, which was better, but still too high. The room was quieter now. The initial panic had settled into a watchful waiting. Dr. Vance pulled a stool up to the bedside. She decided to do a full physical examination herself, from head to toe, looking for anything the paramedics might have missed. She checked his eyes, his throat, and his neck. She listened to his lungs again. Then she moved down to his arms and legs. She was looking for signs of trauma, hidden bruises, lacerations, or tender spots that might point to internal injury. She felt his arms, which were muscular and toned. As she checked his left arm, near the shoulder, she paused. There was a small bandage there. It wasn't one of the hospital's dressings. It looked like a standard adhesive bandage you could buy at any drugstore. It was slightly peeling at the corner. Thinking it might be covering a scrape from his fall on the set, she gently peeled it back to clean the wound. But when she looked underneath, her confusion deepened. There was no scrape. There was no road rash. Instead, there was a tiny, precise puncture mark in the skin. It was surrounded by a small yellowish bruise. Dr. Vance stared at it. It didn't look like an injury from hitting the pavement. It looked clinical. It looked like a needle mark.
Did the paramedics give him a shot in the arm? She asked the nurse standing nearby. The nurse checked the chart. No, they gave him IV fluids in the antecubital fossa, the elbow. They didn't give any IM injections in the shoulder. Dr. Vance frowned. She touched the area gently. It wasn't hot, meaning there wasn't a major infection, but the bruising looked recent, perhaps within the last 24 hours. She looked back at Keanu's face. Why would he have a needle mark in his arm that he was covering with a bandage while filming an action movie? Her mind started to race through possibilities. Was he sick? Was he taking medication he hadn't told anyone about? Or was there something else going on? The discovery didn't make sense with the image of the healthy, dedicated actor, but it was a real clue in a room full of mysteries. She decided to hold off on mentioning it to the crowd outside until she knew more. She stood up and walked to the counter, washing her hands. She looked at the clock. They had been here for 45 minutes. He was stable, but he wasn't waking up. "Run a toxicology screen," she said to the nurse, her voice low, "and a full blood panel. Check his electrolytes again. Specifically, I want you to check his potassium and magnesium levels. And check for anything unusual, heavy metals, unusual compounds. Just sweep it all." The nurse looked surprised but nodded. "You think there's something in his system?" "I don't know," admitted Dr. Vance, looking back at the patient. "But his heart is acting up, and his scans are clean. And I just found a mark on his arm that doesn't fit the story of a simple collapse. We need to keep digging." The doctor walked back to the bedside. She adjusted the covers over Keanu, making sure he was warm. The steady beep of the monitor was the only sound in the room. Outside, the world was waiting. The media was probably swarming, and his friends were praying. But in here, it was just Dr. Vance and a puzzle she was determined to solve. She had a feeling that this tiny mark on his arm was the key to unlocking the mystery, and what she would find would soon leave everyone stunned. She sat back down to wait for the lab results, her eyes never leaving the monitor, determined not to let anything happen to him on her watch. The waiting room inside the emergency department was slowly filling up with a different kind of energy. It wasn't the usual noise of worried families and sick patients. Instead, it was a low buzzing hum of whispers and cell phones. The producers from the movie set had arrived, along with a few people who claimed to be close friends. They were huddled in the corner, looking out of place in their expensive suits and Hollywood sunglasses, pacing back and forth on the linoleum floor. Security guards stood near the main entrance, keeping back the curious looks from other patients who realized someone important was behind the sliding glass doors of the trauma unit. Inside Trauma Room 1, the atmosphere was much more serious, but also incredibly confusing. Dr. Vance was staring at a stack of blood test results that had just slid out of the printer. She held the papers in her hands, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers over and over again, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Usually, when a healthy man in his 50s collapses suddenly, there's a clear villain. It's a clogged artery, a burst vessel in the brain, or a massive infection. But in Keanu's case, the numbers were telling two different stories. "His cardiac enzymes are slightly elevated, but not enough for a heart attack," Dr. Vance said, mostly to herself, but the nurse standing nearby was listening. "His white blood cell count is normal, so it's likely not a severe infection. But look at his hemoglobin and his hematocrit. They're way down, and his inflammatory markers are through the roof." The nurse leaned in, peering at the report. "It looks like his body has been through a major physical trauma, doctor, like he was in a car wreck or a bad fall. But he just collapsed on set." "Exactly," Dr. Vance replied, walking back to the bedside. "His body is reacting as if it has been beaten up, yet he has no single broken bone. The CT scans showed no internal bleeding. It doesn't make sense."
She stood over Keanu again. He was still unconscious, though his breathing had stabilized thanks to the oxygen. The color was slowly returning to his cheeks, but he looked exhausted in a way that went far beyond just a lack of sleep. It was a deep, bone-deep weariness. Dr. Vance felt a rising sense of urgency. If she didn't figure out the cause, she couldn't treat the problem. She could only keep him stable, and that wasn't enough. She remembered the bandage on his arm. It had been nagging at her since she found it. It was such a small detail, easy to overlook in the chaos of a resuscitation, but it felt out of place. Action heroes get cuts and bruises on their faces, hands, and knees. They don't usually have mysterious, covered puncture wounds on their upper arms. Dr. Vance pulled on a fresh pair of gloves. She gently took Keanu's left arm and turned it so the light hit the bandage clearly. She used a pair of tweezers to slowly peel back the adhesive. The bandage came away, sticking slightly to his skin. Underneath, the small puncture mark was now clearly visible. It wasn't a bug bite. It wasn't a scrape from a prop. It was a perfect, circular hole made by a needle. But it wasn't the kind of mess you see from drug use, where the skin is scarred or bruised from repeated attempts. This was precise, clean, and professional. What caught Dr. Vance's attention even more was the bruising around it. It was a yellowish-green color, fading, but there was also a newer ring of purple around the site. This meant it had been done recently, perhaps more than once. "This isn't an IV site," Dr. Vance murmured. She called the nurse over. "Does this look like a phlebotomy draw to you?" The nurse looked closely and shook her head. "No, doctor. Phlebotomy draws are usually in the crease of the arm, and they use smaller needles. This looks like a larger bore needle. Maybe a biopsy? Or a donation port?" A donation port. The words hung in the air. Dr. Vance's mind began to race. If he was donating something, what would cause his body to crash like this? Blood donation makes you tired, but it doesn't usually cause atrial fibrillation and collapse unless you do it too often. But this wasn't just blood. She walked over to the computer terminal mounted on the wall. She logged in and began to type, accessing not just the hospital's records, but a broader national medical database that doctors use to check patient history from other hospitals. She knew this was a sensitive step, checking up on a celebrity's private medical history, but it was necessary to save his life. She justified it to herself as a clinical imperative. She typed in his name and date of birth. The screen loaded for a moment, flashing a cursor. Then a list of recent visits popped up. Dr. Vance scanned the list. There were routine checkups, a visit for a twisted ankle last year, and then a visit to a specialized hematology clinic just 3 days ago. "Hematology," Dr. Vance whispered. She clicked on the note, but the details were encrypted and required a special code she didn't have. However, the billing code was visible. It was a code for a specific procedure, one that Dr. Vance hadn't seen in years because it was so rare for a donor to undergo it voluntarily, especially without a family member in direct need. She turned back to the nurse, her mind connecting the dots. The low blood pressure, the collapse, the strange needle mark, it all made sense now. She wasn't treating a victim of a heart attack. She wasn't treating a victim of a stroke. She was treating a man who literally gave a part of himself to someone else, and his body had simply run out of gas. The realization hit Dr. Vance like a physical force. She took a step back, clutching the counter to steady herself. She looked at Keanu, lying there so helpless, and the contrast between his action star image and the reality of his situation was staggering. The media outside thought he was just another celebrity who partied too hard or worked himself into a collapse, but they were wrong.
"Get me the phone," Dr. Vance said to the nurse, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to call that hematology clinic and find his personal assistant. I need to ask him a question, and I need the truth this time." The nurse handed her the receiver. Dr. Vance dialed the number on the screen, her eyes never leaving Keanu's face. As the phone rang on the other end, she felt a chill run down her spine. The story she was uncovering wasn't a tragedy of negligence, but a story of sacrifice that was almost unheard of in today's world, and she was the only one in the hospital who knew it yet. The line clicked, and a receptionist answered. Dr. Vance identified herself and demanded to speak to the specialist in charge of Keanu's case.
While she waited to be connected, she looked at the puncture wound one last time. It wasn't a wound of weakness, it was a wound of love, and that discovery was about to change everything about how the world saw this man. Dr. Vance stood by the nurse's station, the phone receiver pressed tight against her ear. The hallway outside the trauma room was quiet compared to the chaos of the last hour, but the tension was still thick, hanging in the air like static. The specialist on the other end of the line was hesitant, clearly worried about patient privacy laws, but Dr. Vance was persistent. She didn't care about lawsuits or paperwork right now. She cared about the man lying unconscious in room 1. "Doctor, I understand the confidentiality," Dr. Vance said, her voice low and firm. "But I am the attending physician treating him right now for what looks like heart failure. If I don't know exactly what procedures he underwent 3 days ago, I can't stabilize him properly. I need to know. Was it a high-dose harvest?" There was a long pause on the line, filled with the sound of rustling papers and heavy breathing. Finally, the voice on the other end sighed. "Yes, it was a peripheral blood stem cell harvest. A very large volume. We advised him strictly that he would need at least 2 weeks of total rest, possibly more. His body was depleted of white blood cells and platelets. He was basically immunocompromised and anemic when he walked out of that clinic." Dr. Vance closed her eyes for a second, the pieces of the puzzle finally snapping together with a loud, clear click. "Thank you," she whispered, and she hung up the phone. She turned around to face the small group of people still waiting in the hallway. The producers were checking their watches, looking annoyed and anxious. The personal assistant, a young man with messy hair and a pale face, was sitting on a plastic chair with his head in his hands. Dr. Vance walked straight past the producers and stopped in front of the assistant. She didn't say a word to the others, she just pointed a finger at the assistant. "You, come with me now." The assistant looked up, terrified. He glanced at the producers, who seemed surprised by the doctor's abruptness, but he slowly stood up and followed Dr. Vance into a small, empty consultation room down the hall. She closed the sliding glass door behind them, shutting out the noise. The room was tiny, with a desk and 2 chairs, and the fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Dr. Vance leaned against the desk, crossing her arms. She looked at the assistant with a mix of anger and amazement. "He didn't have a heart attack," she stated, watching the assistant's reaction closely. The assistant swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room. He didn't? I mean, that's good. That's great news, right?" "He collapsed because his body is completely empty," Dr. Vance said, her voice softening but becoming more intense. "I just got off the phone with the hematology clinic. I know about the stem cell harvest. I know about the donation." The assistant slumped back into his chair, covering his face with his hands again. "Oh God," he muffled through his palms. "He made me promise not to tell anyone. He didn't want a media circus. He didn't want people to think he was doing it for attention." "Who was it for?" Dr. Vance asked gently. The assistant lowered his hands. His eyes were red like he had been holding back tears for hours. He took a shaky breath. "It's a little girl. She's the daughter of one of the crew members. He's a grip. He's been working on this crew for 20 years. He mentioned a few months ago that his daughter was sick, that she needed a transplant, but nobody in the family was a match." Dr. Vance stayed silent, letting him continue. "Keanu heard about it," the assistant said, shaking his head in disbelief. "He didn't make a big announcement. He just went to the guy privately. He asked if he could get tested. And he was a match, a perfect match. So for the last week, he's been getting injections to boost his stem cells. It makes your bones ache, doctor. It makes you feel like you have the flu. And then 3 days ago, he went in for the harvest. It takes hours. They hook you up to a machine that filters your blood." The assistant wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his shirt. "We told him to tell the director. We told him to delay the shoot, but he refused. He said the girl didn't have time to wait for the movie schedule, and the movie couldn't afford to wait for him to recover. So he just kept going. He wore long sleeves to cover the bruises and the bandages. He didn't sleep because of the pain, but he never complained, not once." Dr. Vance felt a lump form in her throat.
She had treated thousands of patients in her career. She had seen bravery in the face of disease, and she had seen parents do anything for their children. But she had never seen anything like this. A man with immense wealth and power undergoing a painful medical procedure to save the child of a Mumongmuwu crew member and then hiding it so he wouldn't get attention.
Could go back to work and entertain millions of people. He was running on empty, Dr. Vance said, almost to herself. The heat, the exertion of the stunts, the lack of sleep. His heart gave out because he gave his life force away to someone else. He just wants to help people, the assistant whispered. He never asks for anything. He just gives and gives until there's nothing left. Dr. Vance stood up straight. She looked at the assistant with newfound respect. Well, he gave too much this time. His hemoglobin is dangerously low. His electrolytes are a mess. We are lucky he didn't go into full cardiac arrest on that street. Is he going to be okay? The assistant asked, his voice trembling. He will be, Dr. Vance said confidently, but not because of some miracle drug. He just needs to stop. He needs fluids, rest, and iron. He needs to let his body build itself back up, and I am going to make sure he stays in that bed until he is fully recovered. Movie be damned. She walked to the door and paused, looking back at the assistant. You did a good job protecting his secret, but next time, put his health first. The little girl needs her donor alive, not a martyr. The assistant nodded vigorously. I will, I swear. Dr. Vance stepped out of the consultation room and walked back toward the trauma bay. As she passed the producers, they swarmed her again, asking questions about when he could be discharged and if they could film around his hospital bed. She stopped and held up a hand, silencing them instantly. Mr. Reeves is not suffering from a simple injury or an illness brought on by lifestyle. He is suffering from severe physical depletion and anemia due to a significant medical procedure he underwent recently. The producers looked confused. A procedure? What procedure? We didn't know about any surgery. That is his business to tell you, not mine, Dr. Vance said, her voice cold and professional. But I can tell you this, if he had kept pushing himself for another day, the outcome would have been tragic. He is staying here for several days. He is not working. He is not taking calls. He is going to sleep. She didn't wait for their response. She walked through the sliding doors of the trauma room. The nurses looked up at her, sensing the shift in her mood. They could tell she had solved the mystery. Start an iron infusion, Dr. Vance ordered as she walked to the bedside, and get him some warm blankets. Let's make him comfortable. She stood over Keanu, looking down at him with a completely different perspective now. The action hero label seemed so shallow. The sad Keanu memes on the internet seemed so missing the point. This man wasn't sad. He was quiet because he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, lifting up strangers whenever he could. He reached out and gently squeezed his hand. It was cool to the touch, but his fingers twitched slightly in response. He wasn't waking up yet, but his body was finally getting the chance to heal. Dr. Vance thought about the little girl in the pediatric ward somewhere else in the city, probably recovering from the transplant that would save her life. She thought about the grip, the father, who must be going crazy with worry about both his daughter and the man who saved her. It was a web of kindness that Dr. Vance had never seen in this hospital, a place usually filled with tragedy and despair. She pulled the chair closer to the bedside and sat down. She didn't care about the other patients waiting or the paperwork piling up on her desk. For a moment, she just wanted to sit there in the presence of a goodness that was rare in this world. The discovery of the needle mark on his arm had led her to a discovery of the human spirit, and it left her stunned, silent, and deeply moved. The steady beep of the heart monitor no longer sounded like an emergency. It sounded like a rhythm of hope, beating for two people now instead of one. The early morning sun was just beginning to rise over the city,
casting a pale gray light through the blinds of the hospital room. The chaos of the previous day had faded into a quiet rhythm. The machines were still beeping, but the alarms were silent. Keanu was finally waking up. It had been nearly 12 hours since he collapsed. His eyes fluttered open, squinting against the harsh fluorescent light above the bed. But for a moment, he looked confused, not recognizing the white ceiling or the rails on the bed. But then memory seemed to flood back, and his body relaxed.
Dr. Vance was sitting in the corner chair, reviewing charts on her tablet. She noticed him move and stood up immediately, walking over to the bedside. She checked his pulse and looked into his eyes with a small penlight. "Welcome back," she said softly. "You gave us quite a scare." Keanu tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness kept him pinned to the pillow. He licked his dry lips, and his voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "What happened? Did I fall?" "You did more than fall," Dr. Vance said, adjusting his pillow so he was more comfortable. "Your heart went into an irregular rhythm because your body was severely depleted. You were running on fumes, Keanu. Honestly, it is a miracle you didn't collapse sooner." He looked down at his arms, seeing the IV lines and the small bandage on his shoulder. A look of realization crossed his face, followed quickly by a look of embarrassment. He knew he had been caught. The secret he'd tried so hard to keep was out in the open, at least to the medical team. "The harvest," he whispered, more to himself than to the doctor. "I thought I had more time." "You didn't have time," Dr. Vance corrected him gently. "You pushed your body past the limit. But I know why you did it. My nurse spoke with your assistant. We know about the little girl." Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, letting out a long, slow breath. When he opened them again, there was no regret, only a softness. "Is she okay? Did the transplant work?" "She is stable, and because of you, she has a fighting chance. But you have to understand something. You are not a machine. You can't save everyone else if you destroy yourself in the process." He managed a weak, lopsided smile. "I just wanted to help. Her dad, he's a good man. He's been on the crew for years. He was so worried. I couldn't just stand there and do nothing." Just then, the heavy sliding glass door to the room opened slowly. A man in work boots and a wrinkled flannel shirt stepped inside. It was the Grip, the father of the girl. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. He hesitated near the door, holding his hat in his hands, twisting it nervously. He looked at Keanu lying in the hospital bed, and his eyes filled with tears. Dr. Vance nodded at the father and stepped back into the corner to give them privacy. The man walked slowly to the side of the bed. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at the actor, his hero, who was now pale and weak because of his daughter. The sight of it broke something inside him. "You didn't have to do that," the father choked out, his voice cracking. "You didn't have to do any of it. You're you, and I'm just a Grip. Why would you do that for my baby?" Keanu struggled to reach his hand out from under the covers. The father took it, his rough, calloused hand gently squeezing Keanu's pale fingers. "Because she needed it. I could give it. That's all that matters. Family is everything, man. Your family is your family." The father broke down sobbing, his head bowing low. He wept not just out of relief for his daughter, but out of sheer disbelief at the kindness of this man. The world often looked at celebrities as distant, untouchable figures, interested only in money and fame. But here, in this small hospital room, the myth was stripped away, leaving only a human being who had given a piece of his life to a stranger. "She's gonna live," the father said between sobs, "because of you." "No," Keanu said, squeezing his hand back, "because she's a fighter. I just gave her the tools. Now, please, stop crying. I'm making me feel like I'm dying, and I'm just trying to get some sleep." The father laughed through his tears, wiping his face with his sleeve. It was a moment of pure, unscripted humanity. There were no cameras, no makeup artists, no directors. Just two men connected by an act of life. Dr. Vance watched from the corner, feeling her own eyes stinging. In her line of work, she saw the worst of people, the violence, the neglect, the pain.
But every once in a while, she saw the best. This was one of those times. The discovery she had made the day before, the confusion over the needle mark, had led to this moment. It wasn't a scandal, it was a revelation. Later that afternoon, the hospital corridors were buzzing with a different kind of energy. The news had leaked that Keanu Reeves was in the hospital, and the media was swarming outside the main entrance. Reporters were camping out on the sidewalk, vans with satellite dishes blocked the street, and fans were holding up candles and get well signs. Inside, the security team was working overtime. The producers from the movie were back, looking stressed, trying to figure out how to spin the story. They were worried about the insurance, the production delays, and the press. They hovered around the nurses' station, demanding updates.
Dr. Vance walked out of Keanu's room to talk to them. She had had enough of their business talk. "He is being discharged tomorrow," she announced to the group of suits. "But he is not going back to work. He needs at least 2 weeks of complete rest. No stunts, no heavy lifting, no long hours." The lead producer sighed, tapping his pen on his clipboard. "Doctor, please, we are on a tight schedule. Can't we film scenes where he is sitting, or just dialogue?" Dr. Vance stepped closer to the producer, lowering her voice so the patients in the waiting area wouldn't hear. "Let me make this clear. This man saved a child's life 3 days ago. He nearly died yesterday because he came straight back to work instead of resting. If you push him now and he collapses again, he might not get back up. Do you want that on your conscience? Do you want to be the people who worked a man into his grave?" The producer looked down at his shoes, looking ashamed. The other producers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. The gravity of the situation finally hit them. They weren't just dealing with an actor, they were dealing with a medical miracle and a human being who had sacrificed his own health for another. 2 weeks, the producer muttered quietly. "Okay, we can rewrite the schedule. We'll shoot around him." "Good," Dr. Vance said. "And another thing, when you talk to the press, don't lie. Tell them he is exhausted and recovering. If you want to honor him, don't turn this into a tabloid story." The next morning, the time came for Keanu to leave. He was sitting in a wheelchair, dressed in comfortable sweatpants and a hoodie, looking tired but much better than he had the day before. The color was returning to his face. His assistant was pushing him toward the exit. As they neared the sliding glass doors of the main lobby, Dr. Vance walked alongside them. "Take the iron pills," she reminded him, "and come back in a week for a checkup. If I see you on set before then, I will personally tie you to this bed." Keanu laughed softly. "I promise, doctor. Thank you for everything." "You're a good man, Keanu," she said, stopping at the threshold. "Take care of yourself so you can keep doing what you do." The assistant pushed the wheelchair through the doors. The crowd outside roared as they saw him. Cameras flashed wildly, and reporters shouted questions. But Keanu didn't put on a show. He didn't wave or smile for the cameras. He just looked at the crowd, gave a small, tired nod of acknowledgement, and lowered his head as the security team helped him into a waiting black SUV. Dr. Vance stood inside the glass doors, watching him drive away. The lobby was quiet again. A nurse came up beside her, looking out at the departing crowd. "Did you hear what he did? About the little girl?" the nurse asked quietly. "Yes, I did," replied Dr. Vance. "It's amazing," the nurse said. "I've been a nurse for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like that. Usually, people with that much money and power are the first to complain, the first to demand special treatment. But he just gave." Dr. Vance nodded. She looked down at the chart in her hand, then back at the street. The story that the media would tell would probably be about a Hollywood star fainting from heat exhaustion. They would talk about the movie, the stunt work, and the fame. But the real story, the one about the needle mark, the depleted blood, and the secret trip to the hospital to save a stranger's child, was something much deeper. It was a story about character.
It was a reminder that the people we see on screen, larger than life, are still human beings with hearts that can be bigger than the movies they make. Dr. Vance turned and walked back toward the elevators, her step a little lighter than before. The world could be a hard place, but today she had seen proof that there was still incredible goodness in it, and that was a diagnosis that made her feel hopeful.